The Boy from Kyiv, the untold story of Koum and WhatsApp. There is a village on the outskirts of Kyiv, Ukraine, where the winters arrive without mercy, and the summers feel like a brief, borrowed kindness. The roads there are unpaved. The houses are modest, sometimes just a single room shared between a family. And in the 1970s and 1980s, life in this part of the Soviet Union moved at the pace of quiet endurance. People worked, people waited, and people did not dream too loudly, because in that world, dreaming was a luxury that circumstances rarely allowed. It was here, in a small village outside the Ukrainian capital, that a boy named Koum was born in 1976. His world was small. His family had very little. His father worked in construction, often traveling to find whatever work was available. His mother stayed home, doing what millions of mothers across the Soviet bloc did, stretching small resources over large needs, making something out of almost nothing. They had no hot running water. They had no abundance. But they had each other, and they had a kind of dignity that poverty could not erase. What shaped Koum in those early years was not technology, it was not ambition. It was something simpler and more foundational, the feeling of being left out. In the Soviet Union, communication was controlled, monitored, filtered. Information was a tool of the state. Ordinary people spoke carefully. Even within families, there was an awareness that words had consequences. The idea that you could speak freely, that you could connect with another person without fear of surveillance or interception, that was not a given. That was a dream. And yet that dream, that longing for private, honest, human connection would one day drive Koum to build something used by more than 2 billion people on Earth. But first, he would have to survive the journey there. By the time Koum was 16 years old, the Soviet Union was crumbling. The world he had grown up in was dissolving around him, and his mother, watching the uncertainty unfold, made a decision that would change everything. She had heard the stories of Jewish families who had made it to America, of a country where a person could work hard and actually be rewarded for it. She applied for refugee status. And in 1992, she and her teenage son packed what little they could carry and boarded a plane for the United States. They landed in Mountain View, California, in the heart of what would one day be called Silicon Valley. The irony of that geography is almost cinematic, as if the universe had a plan for this quiet, reserved boy who barely spoke English and had no idea what a venture capitalist was, or that technology companies were quietly changing the world just a few miles from where he was trying to figure out how to survive. Survival was not a metaphor. It was immediate and practical. Jan and his mother moved into a small apartment. They were on government assistance, food stamps helped them eat. His mother cleaned houses to earn money. Jan himself worked as a janitor at a local grocery store. There were nights, by his own later account, when the refrigerator was nearly empty. There were moments when the distance between where they were and where they needed to be felt impossibly vast. But there was one place that was free, one place that offered warmth and knowledge, and something that felt, for a kid like Koum, like possibility. That place was the public library. He began spending hours there. At first it was about learning English, consuming books, newspapers, anything he could get his hands on. But slowly, something else caught his attention: computers. In the mid-1990s, personal computers were just beginning to change how ordinary people interacted with information. Koum had never had access to a computer growing up. But in the public library, he could sit in front of one and explore. And what he found when he explored was a language not English, but something that felt even more natural to his analytical mind: code. He began teaching himself programming with the same quiet determination that had helped his family navigate poverty. He bought used textbooks with money he barely had. He joined computer hacker groups not to cause harm, but because those communities were where the real knowledge lived. He absorbed everything he could. He was not the most social kid. He was not the most visible, but he was relentless. He enrolled at San Jose State University, studying mathematics and computer science. But the classroom moved too slowly for someone who was learning just as fast, maybe faster, on his own. Around the same time, something happened that gave his skills a real-world test. He applied for a job at Yahoo, and almost improbably, they said yes. It was 1,997. Yahoo was not yet the struggling giant it would later become. It was electric, expanding, buzzing with the energy of the early internet boom. For Koum, a Ukrainian immigrant who had been on food stamps just a few years earlier, walking into that building was like stepping into a different universe. He was 21 years old. He had never worked in a professional tech environment, and yet here he was, a systems engineer at one of the most talked about companies in the world. He would stay for nearly a decade. Those 9 years at Yahoo were his real education, not in the classroom sense, but in the way that only experience can teach you. He learned what scale looked like, what it meant to build systems that handled millions of users, millions of requests, millions of data points every single day. He learned what happened when infrastructure broke under pressure and how to build things that wouldn't. He learned the difference between good engineering and great engineering. And he developed a philosophy about technology that was rooted in something most companies talked about but rarely practiced: simplicity. But he also learned, perhaps most importantly, what he did not want. Because Yahoo, over those years, evolved into something that frustrated him deeply: ads multiplied. The user experience became cluttered. Features piled on top of features until the product felt heavy, distracted, driven more by revenue models than by genuine human need. Koum watched this transformation and quietly filed it away as a cautionary tale. If he ever built something of his own, it would not look like this. It would not feel like this. He also formed a friendship during those Yahoo years that would change his life. His name was Brian Acton, a Stanford graduate, sharp and principled in his own right. Acton shared Koum's engineering values, the belief that the best products were not necessarily the most complex ones, but the most honest ones. They spent hours together debating ideas, dissecting bad design, imagining something better. When they eventually left Yahoo within a short time of each other, the friendship didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. In 2007, Apple released the first iPhone. The world shifted. And Koum, watching this happen, began thinking about what it meant. It was January 2009. Koum had recently bought his first iPhone. He was unemployed at the time. He and Brian Acton had both applied to work at Facebook and been rejected. That rejection, which at the time must have stung, would later become one of the great ironies of Silicon Valley history. But in the moment, Koum was simply a man with time on his hands and a new phone in his pocket. He visited a friend, Alex Fishman, and began talking about an idea. The App Store had just launched a few months earlier, and Koum had noticed something. When you changed your status on a mobile device, when you updated what you were doing or where you were, your contacts could see it. It was simple, but it was also, in a small way, a form of communication. Not a message exactly, more like a signal, a quiet way of saying, "Here I am, this is me right now." He went home that night and wrote the framework for what would become WhatsApp. The name came from the phrase, "What's up?" the casual human greeting that people actually used. He wanted the product to feel that way, informal, approachable, like talking to a friend rather than operating a piece of software. He registered the company, WhatsApp Inc., in California in February 2009. He was 33 years old. The earliest version of the app barely worked. It crashed constantly. The servers were unreliable. The user experience was rough. And Koum, frustrated with the progress, nearly quit before he had really started. By his own account, he was ready to walk away. But Brian Acton, who was not yet officially part of the company, sent him a message that simply said, "Reset, move forward." It was the kind of encouragement that matters most when it comes from someone who means it. So he kept going. The early pivot that transformed WhatsApp from a status update novelty into something genuinely powerful came when Apple introduced push notifications. Suddenly, when one user sent a message in the app, the other person's phone would buzz even if the app wasn't open. People began using WhatsApp not as a status board, but as a messenger, a real, live, human-to-human messaging tool. And once that happened, something clicked. The product began to feel necessary. Acton joined the company officially in October 2009, investing $250,000 of his own money as a co-founder. And together, the two men began building in earnest. What made WhatsApp different was not any single feature. It was a philosophy, a set of decisions that, in retrospect, seem obvious, but at the time required real courage to maintain. The first decision was no advertising, ever. Koum had grown up watching how advertising warped incentives, how it transformed products from tools for users into products for advertisers. He had watched Yahoo become cluttered with ads. He had seen what happened when attention became the commodity. WhatsApp would not do that. The app would cost 99 cents per year, a price so low it was barely a price at all. And in exchange, the company would owe nothing to advertisers. The user was the customer, period. The second decision was no games, no gimmicks, no social feed, no timeline. WhatsApp would do one thing, and it would do that one thing better than anything else in the world. Send messages, receive messages. That was it. The third decision, and perhaps the one that meant the most to Koum personally, given where he came from, was privacy. WhatsApp would not store messages on its servers. Once a message was delivered, it was gone. The company would not sell user data. It would not build profiles. It would not monitor what you said or who you said it to. This was not just a business decision. For a man who had grown up in a country where communication was surveilled by the state, where words could have consequences, privacy was not a feature, it was a value. It was something close to sacred. These choices made WhatsApp an outlier. Almost every other tech company in Silicon Valley was racing toward more engagement, more data, more monetization. WhatsApp was racing toward less, toward restraint, toward trust. And the world responded. The growth was unlike anything the founders had anticipated. In the early days, it spread through immigrant communities, exactly the kind of people, like Koum himself, who needed a cheap, reliable way to communicate across borders. A Nigerian family in London staying connected with relatives in Lagos. A Brazilian worker in Spain calling home to his wife. A Ukrainian grandmother sending messages to her grandchildren in America. WhatsApp cost nothing beyond the initial download in many markets. It required only a phone number, no username, no email address, no elaborate sign-up process. You opened the app and the people you knew were already there because your phone contacts were your network. This design decision was elegant and powerful. By anchoring itself to the phone number rather than a separate social identity, WhatsApp became invisible infrastructure. It didn't ask you to build a new online persona. It just connected the people you already knew in the most frictionless way possible. By 2011, WhatsApp was among the top 20 apps in the United States. But its real dominance was happening elsewhere, in Europe, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, and Africa. In many countries, it became the default way to communicate, not just for personal messages, but for business. Families used it, schools used it, churches used it, street vendors used it to coordinate deliveries, journalists used it to protect sources. It became woven into the daily fabric of hundreds of millions of lives. The numbers were staggering. In 2011, users were sending 1 billion messages per day. By 2012, that figure had multiplied several times over. The team remained incredibly small at one point. Fewer than 50 employees were supporting hundreds of millions of users. That ratio was almost unheard of in the tech industry. It was a testament to the engineering philosophy Koum had built. Simple, stable, scalable. Do less, but do it right. The company remained privately held. They had taken some funding, notably from Sequoia Capital, which invested about $60 million across 2 rounds. But Koum and Acton were not chasing a traditional Silicon Valley growth story. They were not burning money on marketing. They were not racing toward an IPO. They were just building, day after day, with an almost monastic focus on making the product work better for the people using it. Then, in 2014, the phone rang. Mark Zuckerberg had been watching WhatsApp for a long time. Facebook was the world's dominant social network, but WhatsApp had something Facebook's messaging products did not: genuine trust. Users around the world didn't just use WhatsApp. They relied on it. They trusted it with their most personal conversations. And in markets where Facebook struggled, where feature phones were giving way to smartphones, where data costs made heavy apps impractical, where people were wary of social media but hungry for simple communication, WhatsApp was king. The acquisition talks moved quickly. Zuckerberg and Koum met in person. The discussions were serious, substantive. Koum was protective of his product, his team, and above all, his values. He had conditions. WhatsApp would remain independent. The no advertising commitment would be honored. The privacy philosophy would be preserved. Zuckerberg agreed. On the 19th of February 2014, Facebook announced the acquisition of WhatsApp for approximately $19 billion, a combination of cash and stock that made it, at the time, the largest acquisition of a venture-backed company in history. The number 19 billion sits at the edge of human comprehension. It is so large that it requires a moment of stillness to absorb. And for Jan Koum, the weight of that number carried a meaning that went far beyond money. Because here was a man who had come to America with nothing, who had eaten with food stamps, who had cleaned floors in a grocery store, who had taught himself to code in a public library, who had been rejected by Facebook, who had nearly quit building WhatsApp before it had a single real user. And now, that same company that had turned him away was paying him nearly $20 billion for what he had built. He signed the acquisition papers at the welfare office in Mountain View, the same one his mother had visited years ago when they first arrived in America with nothing. He could have signed them anywhere. But he chose that place deliberately because he wanted to remember, because he never wanted to forget what it had cost to get there and who had been with him at the beginning. The years that followed the acquisition were not without complexity. Jan Koum remained with Facebook as WhatsApp continued to grow. By 2018, the platform had surpassed 1.5 billion users. But tensions with Facebook's leadership over data privacy, the very issue that had been a cornerstone of WhatsApp's identity, began to mount. When Facebook pushed to monetize WhatsApp's massive user base, to share data between platforms, to integrate advertising into what had always been an ad-free experience, Koum found himself at odds with the direction things were moving. In April 2018, he resigned from Facebook. He left behind a seat on the board and hundreds of millions of dollars in unvested stock. He simply walked away. The man who had grown up with nothing chose his values over the money. In an industry built on the relentless accumulation of both, that choice was its own kind of quiet statement. The story of Jan Koum is not really about technology. It is about something older and more human than any app or algorithm. It is about what it means to be an outsider, to grow up in scarcity, to cross an ocean with nothing, to sit in a library, teaching yourself the language of a world that has not yet made room for you, and to refuse to let that story be the end of the sentence. It is about the specific kind of determination that only comes from having had very little. When you know what nothing feels like, you treat what you build with a seriousness that comfort cannot manufacture. Jan Koum built WhatsApp the way he had survived his childhood, carefully, efficiently, without waste. He did not build it for the attention of Silicon Valley. He built it for the people who needed it, the immigrants, the far-flung families, the communities stretching across borders and time zones, trying to stay connected. And they came, in their hundreds of millions, in their billions, because what he built was not just an app, it was a phone call between a mother and her son. It was a message sent across an ocean to someone you love. It was the simple, profound act of saying, I am here, I'm thinking of you, I have not forgotten where we came from. There is something extraordinary about the fact that one of the world's most widely used communication tools was built by a man who grew up in a place where communication itself was something to be feared, who came to America with 20 years of watching words be monitored and controlled, and then dedicated his professional life to building a space where words could flow freely, privately, safely. The boy from the village outside Kyiv. The teenager who stocked shelves and cleaned floors and sat in the library long after other kids had gone home. The engineer who was told no by the very company that would eventually pay him billions to say yes. Yang Koum's story is proof of something that people in every difficult circumstance need to hear. That where you start is not where you have to end. That the world you grew up in does not define the world you are capable of building. And sometimes, the most powerful things are built not by the people with the most resources, but by the people with the most to say.